I want to welcome all of you to this April meeting of the Kentucky Civil War Roundtable. It's marvelous to see the crowd, and it's really marvelous to see all the new people who are interested, guests and new members. And it shows a roundtable that is continuing to grow, which is something we really are interested in seeing happen. The first thing I'd like to do is ask Bill Swinford to come up and have the hosts introduce their guests. And Bill, here's the hookup.
Okay. Thank you, Ken.
Yes, sir.
I think I got it. I'll just hold it. Can everybody hear me? All right. We have a lot of guests today, and one person has 17, I understand. So she's going to have to introduce them all. We're going to start by tables. So Justice Van Meter. Chief Justice Van Meter.
Real estate agency stars. I have Sean and Lucas Hairston, who are Donna Terrell, our speaker's guests. And I think there's other guests.
All right, well, just stand up like Larry did. All right, Maury. You've got the. Do you have guests? Maury, does anybody else have guests?
Lloyd. And this is Kent Maury, and they are my guests.
I've known them all a long time.
Should I keep going?
Yes, keep going. You've got the floor.
This is Rosamund Trigg-Prinian. This is Matt Cox. Sorry. This is Jane and Garland Van Hook from down around Stanford. Jane is president of the Lincoln County Historical Society. And then we go over here. Our dear friend Ruth Ann Colombo. And my dear friend Cassie Alexander, Bill's wife. Yay! And we have Sarah Hamilton, Sandy Bareilles, and Jim Bareilles, and hold on, there are more out here.
Is there anybody else that's Donna's guest? Please stand up. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, over this table over here.
Yes, I have Tom Black from Richmond. He's a retired Air Force colonel. And I'd also like to mention with me tonight is probably one of our oldest members. Harold Richardson is 97. He became a member in 1956. How many of you are not born then? Thank you.
Thank you. Now, we just heard from the president of the SOBs. And our speaker, wearing pink, she is an SOB. And I'm going to have her explain what that is when she gets the microphone. All right? Next table over. We're going to skip all the way across the room. You're looking around. Does anybody at your table? How about the middle table over here where Mr. Darnell's sitting? Any guests? Over here. Yes.
Yes, I'm going to introduce myself, if I may. My name is Mark Maloney. I'm from Nicholasville, and the reason I chose to stand up and introduce myself is I'd like to recognize my dear friend Charles Parton, who also is 97 and a World War II vet.
Thank you so much. I'm going to call the next table the Maloney table. Is there any guests there?
I'd like to introduce my friend Bill Larkin, former member of this club.
Well, hopefully he'll consider.
My son Andrew Maloney.
Andrew, welcome. table with Tom Sabetta sitting at it. Any guests there? No guests? Mr. McCoy? That table.
John Collins, and guess Shelby Kincaid used to be a member here.
Welcome, Shelby. We'd love to have you back. Maynard Ferguson, that table.
Glad to have two other folks from Richmond here, you guys. Sybil and Paul Fagan. Sybil's a retired educator from Richmond, and Paul's a retired judge from Richmond.
Thank you. In the table next to the wall over there, the far table, any guest? No guest. All right, how about the back table? No guest? Coming back towards the middle, behind Maynard Ferguson's table. The back table in the, no guest? And the table in the corner with Lyle Dalton, Jim Cleveland? No guest. Okay, thank you. And I should have asked everybody to hold their applause until now. Now's the appropriate time to applaud. All right, thank you. Turn it over to Mr. Brown.
Okay, Chris Anderson, here he comes here. He'll give us a rundown on the membership.
Have you seen the movie The Replacements? I'm one of those. Our membership stands at 168. And wasn't too long ago, we had 250 members in this club. So we are actively looking and welcoming new members. Susie, our administrator, has membership applications in the back, and you can also get them on our website, kentuckycivilwar.org. So I will mention that. We're also looking to recruit meeting sponsors. Now, our dues do not cover all the expenses of running this 5-meeting club year. So we also have to do some fundraising. One of the things we decided on last year was to recruit sponsors for the meetings. And with a sponsorship, we do advertising. We allow you to post your literature, however you want to do it. We'll put your logo of your company on here. We'll put you in the newsletter, all for the mere amount of $500. Our meeting in May will be sponsored by George Ridings. George is a board member, and he's also obviously an active supporter. And George will be talking about the Battle of Richmond. I'm not sure who all he's going to invite to speak, but he has newsletters out on the table that we'll talk about that if you're interested. And we also have our own newsletter out there, at least we did have, if you'd be interested in seeing one of those. I want to remind you to be sure to respond or RSVP for the May meeting by May the 2nd. That's very important because Susie's going to be out of town, so we don't want to, box her into, when she gets back the day before the meeting, I think, from being out of town, she wants to go ahead and report to the hotel the number of guests we're going to have because they're real strict about that. And then lastly, our meetings are now posted online on our YouTube channel. We have a videographer back here, and it's very professional. So if you ever miss a meeting and you want to catch one, Kentucky Civil War, I think that's the way it reads if you go on YouTube. So, thank you.
Well, folks, this roundtable was founded by an individual whose name was William Townsend, a lawyer in Lexington. We don't hold that against him. He was the one who founded this organization in 1953. And he put himself and this organization on the map by giving a speech to the Chicago Civil War Roundtable about Cassius Marcellus Clay. And for those of you who have ever listened to the album that records that speech, it is an absolutely spectacular presentation. But the people who actually did the recording at that roundtable meeting was a bookstore in downtown Chicago. And they began selling these discs that you could replay at home and listen to Bill Townsend give this talk. And Townsend became irate that these people would take his product and sell it. And he was threatening to sue them. And then he got a letter from the White House. And he opened it up. And it told him how much I enjoyed listening to you talk about Cassius Marcellus Clay, signed Dwight David Eisenhower. And that ended the threats, right there. That ended the threats. But the Clays, Cassius Marcellus Clay, has been a recurring figure here. And of course, we just recently had a talk on Cassius Marcellus Clay, and by Mel Hankla. And it was a wonderful talk. And now we're going to hear about the lionesses of Whitehall, the house of Cassius Marcellus Clay. He always was called the Lion of Whitehall. But why don't we hear from the lionesses, right? And that's what we'll do tonight. And the speaker is Donna Dodd Terrell. And she's a native of Lexington. She's a graduate of the University of Kentucky with a BA in Education and Journalism, and thereafter a Juris Doctorate degree from the University of Kentucky College of Law. She became the law clerk to Chief Justice Robert Stevens at the Supreme Court of Kentucky and served as Chief Counsel to the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Kentucky for 17 years. She served the federal court system as only one of 9 individuals appointed nationwide to handle pro se civil rights litigation, writs of habeas corpus, and death penalty litigation. That's a lovely thing to be active in. In private practice, she managed many high-profile real estate and farm transaction matters, including those involving Keeneland. She's a proud mother of Daniel V. Wick, Terrell IV. She's also a lifelong avid student of Kentucky history, and boy, I can attest to that. She also is kin to Daniel Boone's family. So she has deep roots in Madison County, and a terrific speaker and a terrific person. I'd like to introduce to you Donna Dodd Terrell.
Are we ready to go? Here we go. Great. Thank you so much, Kent. I think I'm okay here. Who knows? Thank you. Well, I don't anticipate getting a letter from Donald Trump after this tonight, but you just never know what'll happen next. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here, and it is a distinctive privilege to be here tonight. Over most of my 76 years, I've been aware of Cassius Marcellus Clay. He died 47 years before I was born. He died when my granddaddy, Robert Wycliffe Dodd, was 8 years old. My awareness of Cassius began in my 1950s childhood when on our pre-interstate weekly drives to and from my Dodd grandparents' house in Richmond, Kentucky, we would go up and down old US 25 South, and we would drive past homelands that had been the home and land of my 5 greats-grandfather, David Cruz, and I was the little kid in the back seat who would hear the stories. In the late 1700s, David Cruz and Cassius Clay's father, Green Clay, had come up the hill from the fort in Boonesboro and settled on adjoining expanses of lands in what is now called Madison County. Green Clay named his place Claremont. Later, it was named Whitehall, renamed Whitehall. On my granddaddy Dodd's side, at the farm and residence they called homelands, for 2 generations, my 5th and 4th great-grandfathers, David Cruz and David Cruz Jr., were the Clays' next-door neighbors. Thereafter, Samuel Bennett and his wife, Elizabeth Chenault, and my granddaddy Dodd, Elizabeth Chenault and their family were at homelands. My granddaddy Dodd and Elizabeth Chenault were both descendants of Madison County's earliest pioneers, Chenault, Phelps, and Simmons. I think it goes that 8 of Elizabeth Chenault Bennett's 2 great-grandparents were my granddaddy's either 3 or 4 great-grandparents. Mrs. Samuel Bennett, aka Elizabeth Chenault of Homelands, and Mrs. Cassius Marcellus Clay, otherwise known as Mary Jane Warfield of Whitehall, were both born in 1815. Elizabeth Chenault was born in 1815 in the Madison County log cabin of her grandfather, our mutual relative, Josiah Phelps, whose name you'll hear more about in a few minutes. And Mary Jane Warfield was born in 1815 in Lexington. Somehow or another, we're looking at something that's way further down, so I don't know what's going on, but that's okay. Well, we'll live through it, right? In 1833, Mary Jane Warfield married Cassius Marcellus Clay, and the very next year, 1834, Elizabeth Chenault married Samuel Bennett. And thereafter, both families moved to Whitehall and Homelands. Elizabeth Chenault's son, James Bennett, married Mary Jane Warfield's daughter, Sarah Sally Lewis Clay. Another of Elizabeth Chenault's sons, Samuel Paul Bennett, Jr., married Mary Jane Warfield's niece, Mary Winston Warfield. So it's clear that Elizabeth Chenault and Mary Jane Warfield were closely allied. In my childhood household, we had the 78 LP for long playing record of William Townsend's 1952 Chicago Civil War Roundtable address about Cassius Clay, the Lion of Whitehall. And in our home, that record got a lot of airplay, during which you could almost see the steam coming out of my granddaddy's ears, usually right before he left the room. My granddaddy's folks were not as amused by Cassius's antics as seemingly were the audience members at William Townsend's 1952 speech to the Chicago Civil War Roundtable 73 years ago. Growing up, I spent a lot of time in the Waller-Bennett house for my first 13 years. That was where my grandparents were. Back then, the Waller-Bennett house sat at 507 West Main Street in Richmond, Kentucky, on the site of what is the present Madison County Public Library. Waller-Bennett was the son of Samuel Bennett and Elizabeth Chenault. His closest sibling was his sister Isabel Bell Harris Bennett, who you'll hear more about in a few minutes. Waller, a Yale graduate, had grown up at Homelands next door to Cassius, who was also a Yale man. But beyond that, those two men had very different lives. My grandparents called the place Benalt. They merged the names Bennett and Chenault. That's my granddaddy and my dad. 2 doors down, and me, I was 1 month old. 2 doors down was a house once lived in by several of the lionesses of Whitehall and Homelands. As a child, I used to wedge my small feet into the wrought iron fence out in front of that place that you can see and gaze at the seemingly always present fresh flowers in the window. One time, out in the countryside in my youth, I ventured down the clay lane, the then primitive rock bed road that generally ran beside Homeland's and Whitehall's properties. I climbed the property line fence and caroused around in the then dilapidated and wide open remains, disheveled remains of Whitehall. Therein, I recalled my grandmother, my beloved Great Ma, telling that in her quest to find an old grand piano to put in the Waller-Bennett house, she and her friend, Cassius and Mary Jane's granddaughter, Esther Bennett, had gone out to Whitehall to look at Cassius's grand piano, which Esther had offered to my grandmother. Great Ma reported that chickens had been so roosting in Cassius's piano that she could not imagine how anyone would or could ever cleanse out Cassius's piano of the resulting residue. And so Great Ma declined what thereafter, and in all good humor, was always referred to as Cassius's chick-in piano. Eventually, Great Ma acquired an 1842-era Chick-a-Ring brand piano for the Binault house. Great Ma humorously deemed her then highly acclaimed Chick-a-Ring brand gold leaf lined ivory keyed piano to be greatly superior to Cassius Clay's Chick-in piano. Today, that Chick-a-Ring piano sits in my living room, and it and the story attached to it often make me chuckle. Now, this is a stretch, but it's the truth. My mom's second cousin, 4 times removed, and I would like to claim anything I can with regard to, Yeah, back to the house, Mount Brilliant. Is Mount Brilliant there? Yipes, something happened. Okay. Anyway, Isabel Dennison Atchison West was a distant relative of my mother's, and she owned the 1790s built magnificent Kentucky landmark Mount Brilliant on the Russell Cave Road. She owned it from 1863 until 1924. Beneath Mount Brilliant in 1843, Cassius had displayed his Bowie knife skills, gouging skills against a political opponent, and some said he was an assassin hired from New Orleans, Sam Brown. For about 15 years, I sat almost daily in front of a fireplace surrounded by a mantelpiece I acquired from Mount Brilliant when, heartbreakingly, in 2002, it was demolished. After the political Bowie knife gouging melee, Cassius had been brought into Mount Brilliant for medical treatment, and I often pondered the possibility that maybe my mantelpiece had witnessed that scene. So now, let's turn our thoughts to Cassius Marcellus Clay's legacy. Cassius had 2 major legacies, like most of us. The one he intended to have, and the one he never intended to have. Cassius Clay apparently intended his legacy to be that he was perpetually in the spotlight of American history for having been a ferociously combative, virtue-signaling, morally superior advocate for the abolition of African American male enslavement, and that he had flamboyant relationships with women. Commendably, Clay did intend to inspire the abolition of African American male enslavement. However, oxymoronically, Clay apparently did not intend to be inspiring the abolition of any variety of female American disempowerment amounting to a degree of enslavement. Thus, eventually, Cassius, through the lionesses of Whitehall and Homelands, unwittingly, and no doubt unintentionally, became a huge inspiration and catalyst for the women's rights movement and for passage of the 19th Amendment to the American Constitution. To the extent Cassius ever comprehended that he was a huge inspiration for the women's rights movement, he may be over there in the Richmond Cemetery rolling in his grave. To understand how Cassius inspired the abolition of female American disempowerment and/or enslavement and the passage of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote, one need only ponder the events of Cassius's life by putting yourself in the shoes of and by gaining the perspective of the lionesses of Whitehall and Homelands, who were the women who experienced life with Cassius. Thereafter, to survive and to recover, many of those women devoted their lives to ensuring that never again would a woman be so legally powerless and so totally controlled that she would ever have to endure the likes of a Cassius Marcellus Clay. Moreover, despite the monumental women's rights changes these quietly determined women peacefully effectuated, history has generally left the lionesses of Whitehall and Homelands largely in the long, dark shadow cast by Cassius's often violence-stoked spotlight of fame. Cassius's advocacy of black male abolition and adoption of the Emancipation Proclamation and passage of the 13th Amendment commendably somewhat liberated approximately 3.5 million enslaved African Americans. For that, commendably, Cassius is world famous. However, the bigger story here is that about 55 years later, Cassius's daughters and their Chenault Bennett next-door neighbor in-laws inspired passage of the 19th Amendment, which, by giving women voting rights, finally liberated over 50 million essentially disempowered and still somewhat effectively enslaved female Americans. For that, the lionesses of Whitehall and Homelands remain comparatively anonymous. A literal birthplace for America's women's rights activism is very near Madison County, Kentucky's Interstate 75's Boonesboro exit number 95, somewhat better known as Love's Truck Stop. Whitehall and the Homelands are very close thereby. These Madison County pioneering women's rights activists were the descendants of Kentucky's earliest pioneers, whose names appear on the 1907 Daughters of the American Revolution marker at the also nearby site of the original Riverside Boonesboro Fort. And Sarah Hamilton's family has 14 names on that, 12. She and I have had a competition over who has the most. I love it. Well, anyway, Michael Stoner's granddaughter. These women's rights activists, dauntless pioneer grandmothers, were no strangers to struggle, perseverance, determination, and warfare. So who were these women? Well, the primary suffragette lionesses of Whitehall and Homelands were the Clay sisters, and one of their female Clay cousins, as well as the Clay sisters' next-door neighbor, Chenault Bennett, in-laws. The two Chenault Bennett sisters of Homelands, daughters of Samuel Bennett and Elizabeth Chenault, were, were Isabel Bell Harris Bennett and Susan Sue Bennett. The four suffragette Clay sisters the daughters of Cassius Marcellus Clay and Mary Jane Warfield of Whitehall, were Laura Clay, Mary Barr Clay, Annie Warfield Clay, and Sarah Sally Lewis Clay Bennett. The Clay sisters' cousin, who grew up at her grandfather Henry Clay's Lexington Ashland estate, was fellow suffragette Madeline McDowell Breckenridge. And as fate has had it, not only did I live in the Waller Bennett house part of my time growing up, but for the better part of the last 50 years, I've lived on what was part of the Ashland estate when Madeline was growing up there. What inspired these lionesses to work so hard to get women the right to vote? Cassius Marcellus Clay's alleged conduct involving 3 and possibly 4 women was a provocation for the lionesses' activism. These women were his first wife, Mary Jane Warfield, reportedly, possibly, the Russian Imperial Ballet's prima ballerina, Anna Petrov, his second wife, Dora Richardson, and reportedly a newly emancipated African-American woman, Cynthia Bogey. First, let's step into the shoes of Mary Jane Warfield. Cassius stepped into the spotlight of Lexington influence when he married Mary Jane. Mary Jane's family members were pillars of the Lexington community. She was the daughter of Dr. Elisha Warfield Jr. and Mary Barr. Mary Jane's family members were founders of the church she grew up in, Lexington's Christ Church Cathedral. Mary Jane grew up at her father's expansive Lexington farm, The Meadows, which generally ran north of what is now Loudon Avenue. The Meadows mansion was regretfully demolished in the 1960s. However, its legacy remains in that the legendary racehorse Lexington was bred and raised on Mary Jane's father's farm. Today, ironically, Lexington, the horse, so closely affiliated with the Whitehall lioness, stands in all wild cat blue as the triumphant symbol of our entire city. Apparently, sometimes karmic justice does eventually prevail, and maybe for Mary Jane Warfield and the lionesses of Whitehall and Homelands, Lexington's iconic symbol may be evidence that she who laughs last laughs best. Cassius had endless expectations of Mary Jane, for whom he seemingly had scant consideration or empathy. She endured the continual bombardment of consequences imposed upon her by the chaotic and traumatic situations Cassius seemingly repeatedly experienced. At the politically unstable beginning of the Civil War, Cassius quickly tried to grab the spotlight. In 1860, about 8 months before the Civil War started, Cassius had sought the Republican Party's presidential and then vice presidential nominations. For both, he was overlooked. Instead, Cassius's fellow Republican Kentucky native of far more humble and then far less flamboyant circumstances, Abraham Lincoln, won the Republican Party's nomination in the November of 1860 presidential election and thereafter occupied the White House. One additional commonality for Lincoln and Clay is that they both married Lexington women who were born only 3 years apart. According to a report by Kentucky-born Illinois Senator Orville Hickman Browning, Lincoln saw Cassius as a man who had, and I quote, a great deal of conceit and very little sense, end quote, and who, quote, much annoyed, end quote, Lincoln. Reportedly, Lincoln, quote, did not know what to do with Clay, end quote. While keeping his friends close and his political competitor politically, but not physically, closer, in March of 1861, 1 month before the Civil War officially broke out, Lincoln ostensibly rewarded Cassius with a Russian ambassadorship. That ambassadorship, in essence, eventually moved, if not exiled, Lincoln's volatile, highly ambitious, and problematic political competitor, Cassius, to the other side of the planet. Heard anything like that going on lately? However, Lincoln did not get Cassius out of the country soon enough. Before the war broke out in April of 1861 and before Cassius had departed for Russia, Cassius again seized the spotlight. Cassius recruited and commanded the Stranger's Guard, an army of over 300 troops with which Cassius encircled and perhaps, in essence, seized control of the White House and arguably of the president therein. Whether Cassius was protecting Lincoln from invaders or whether Cassius was the invader became a question in some suspicious minds. Concern arose that the Lion of Whitehall planned to become the Lion of White House. Eventually, Cassius was off to Russia. However, about 15 months later, in June of 1862, when the Union cause was winning, Cassius returned to America. Ever the spotlight seeker, Cassius wanted to be made a general in this winning effort. Lincoln made Cassius a general, and some say in title only. About 10 months later, in March of 1863, a somewhat, maybe a little bit hog-tied Cassius frustratedly resigned his generalship. In 1864, Lincoln sent Cassius back to Russia. 2 years later, in April of 1866, Leonid Petrov Clay was born in Russia. The baby's mother was thought by some to have been the Imperial Russian Ballet's prima ballerina, Anna Petrov. Some even asked how bright the spotlights were at the Russian Imperial Ballet. Cassius then apparently returned to the United States, and when he did so, he seemingly may have been accompanied by a woman named Annie and a little boy. A July of 1870 census record from Westchester County, New York, suggests that a man that was 60 years old named Cassius M. Clay, a 30-year-old Russian named Annie, whose last name is somewhat indecipherable, and a 4-year-old Russian boy referred to as Lenny were then living in Yonkers, New York. Supposedly, Cassius adopted the boy and died never having said he was the biological father. Cassius's wife, Mary Jane Warfield, had largely been abandoned for approximately 7 years. Mary Jane had been left to experience the consequences of her husband's actions while struggling to fulfill unfathomable expectations. Cassius left, expecting Mary Jane to parent the 6 surviving of 10 children she had borne for him. Cassius left, expecting Mary Jane to manage vast acreage of farmland with a workforce affected by the chaos of civil war. Cassius left, expecting Mary Jane, the wife of a Union sympathizer, to survive while living within what was largely Confederate sympathizing territory. Cassius returned, seemingly expecting Mary Jane to raise in their home the little Russian boy that had arrived at Whitehall. 1868 was a pivotal year. In 1868, the 14th Amendment bestowed citizenship upon African Americans. Also, in 1868, after 45 years of marriage, Mary Jane Warfield initiated divorce proceedings to gain her freedom from Cassius. Ironically, in his countersuit for divorce, reportedly Cassius Clay charged Mary Jane Warfield with abandonment. During the divorce proceedings, reportedly Cassius attempted to make Mary Jane reimburse him $80,000 for monies he allegedly expended on her during their 45-year marriage. To put that allegation in perspective, the entire value of the approximately 100 enslaved persons Cassius had freed has been estimated to have then been $40,000. Cassius perhaps expected to owe Mary Jane nothing for all she had done. However, Cassius may have expected Mary Jane, the mother of their 10 children, to pay him the value of 200 enslaved lives for the privilege she had had of getting to serve and endure him. Reportedly, probably under what's called the common law of coverture, Cassius also may have claimed ownership of everything that Mary Jane had inherited from her family. After 10 years of divorce litigation, the relative modicum of property Mary Jane did get, reportedly, was hers only so long as she never remarried. Freedom eluded Mary Jane Warfield. Back then, married women were still considered like livestock to, in essence, be the enslaved possessions of their husbands. In the years during which Cassius and Mary Jane's divorce was pending, a black woman, Cynthia Bogey, reportedly gave birth to 3 and possibly 4 mulatto children. Several trees on Ancestry.com allege and indicate that the father of one or more of those children was Cassius Marcellus Clay. Census records for all 4 of these children within that period of time are blank in the space for the name of a father. Census records establish that within this time frame, Cynthia Bogey lived at the Madison County community of Million and thereafter at Foxtown, both of which are close to Whitehall, the then residence of Cassius Clay. In 1872, when the first of these 4 children was born, Cynthia Bogey, who presumably had been born into enslavement, would have been 30 and Cassius would have been 62. Then, 15 years after his divorce from Mary Jane was granted, in 1893, when he was 84 years old, Cassius Marcellus Clay further solidified the lionesses of Whitehall and Homeland when these women of conscience discovered there also was scant legal protection available for children. In 1893, Cassius married an orphan girl. Differing sources suggest she was perhaps somewhere in the range of 12 to 15 years old. A posse was sent to Whitehall to address this situation. It was one of my granddaddy's cousins and Elizabeth Chenault Bennett's cousins through Elizabeth's grandfather, Josiah Phelps, in whose log cabin Elizabeth Chenault Bennett had been born, who William Townsend referred to as being the High Sheriff, Josiah Phelps Simmons, who had led that posse comitatus to Whitehall to address the situation regarding Cassius's new bride, Dora Richardson. Thereafter, the High Sheriff reported back to another cousin, Madison County Judge John Chenault, that the entire posse had been single-handedly rebuked by 84-year-old Cassius igniting his nail-spewing cannons at our relatives. I strongly suspect that posse comitatu had convened at the behest of Elizabeth Chenault Bennett and Mary Jane Warfield Clay and or their progeny. And that, for the siege upon Whitehall, the posse had assembled next door at Homelands. Today, the issues inherent in such a situation presumably are obvious. However, in 1893, the Lionesses and their posse comitatu discovered that was not necessarily the situation. Cassius's divorce litigation, suspected biological parenting of a Russian-born child, second marriage, and alleged biological parenting of one or more children outside of marriage during his divorce proceedings and with a no doubt vulnerable newly emancipated young woman, collectively, seemingly operated like a psychological Bowie knife that carved, sliced, and gouged wounds deep into the souls of many of the women in his life. The healing process for those piercing wounds came when the Lionesses of Whitehall and Homelands resolved to devote their lives to achieving women's rights and passage of the 19th Amendment. And thus, Cassius Clay, the Lion, became a major national catalyst for passage of the 19th Amendment and the American women's rights movement. So what did these Lionesses do to cause passage of the 19th Amendment? Well, the first thing they did was learn the historical and legal basis upon which Americans had come to believe that only men had the right to vote. Our original 1789 U.S. Constitution said nothing about any citizens or anybody else having any voting rights. Some thought the Constitution had bestowed some implied voting rights in federal, state, and local elections, but only for freeholders, meaning white, male citizens who owned land mortgage-free. Thus, women seeking voting rights had to change what had become the male-only voting laws of one federal government, 48 state governments, and a gazillion local governments. Adoption of the 19th Amendment, which would have covered all of that, was the only practical way to achieve full voting rights for women. The Lionesses also learned what the women who had come before them had previously done for the cause of American women's rights. 20 years before Mary Jane Warfield filed for divorce from Cassius, back in July of 1848, the first American Women's Rights Convention was held. It was in a Methodist church in Seneca Falls, New York, and Genevieve's grandmother could have taught us a lot about what went on at that. Those women issued what was then a stunningly radical declaration of women's independence, seeking for women to have the right to be educated, enter the professions, possess, own, and control their own money, and vote. The 1848 Seneca Falls Declaration of Women's Independence was issued at a time in America when conflict was raging about whether newly admitted states and territories out west would be slave states or free states. In the U.S. Senate, Kentucky Senator Henry Clay was negotiating whether African American enslavement could be extended into new U.S. territories and states. Conflict over the freedoms and rights to be accorded to America's African American population provoked America's female American population to examine and compare the absence of rights accorded to women. To many women, it looked like formerly enslaved men were going to have more rights than any women. The 1850 adoption of Henry Clay's Great Compromise staved off the Civil War for another decade. It's no coincidence that this is when Americans, including Henry Clay's granddaughter Madeline McDowell Breckinridge and her Clay cousins and their Chenault Bennett next-door neighbor in-laws, began thinking that they too should have freedom from male disempowerment, unchecked control, and essential enslavement. And that female Americans should also be accorded at least as many federal constitutional rights as some then advocated should be accorded to no longer enslaved African American men. The American women's movement was just gaining momentum when the Civil War sidelined it. After the Civil War in 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed. 3 years later, in 1868, the year Mary Jane filed for divorce, the 14th Amendment was passed. These two amendments supposedly extended most constitutional rights, but not voting rights, to formerly enslaved male African Americans, and apparently not to any women. In 1870, 2 years into Mary Jane's 10 years of divorce litigation, the 15th Amendment was adopted. It prohibited federal and state governments from denying the right to vote based upon a citizen's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Gender wasn't mentioned. Thus, the 15th Amendment was deemed to have only given voting rights to black men. White women would have to wait another 50 years to get the right to vote. Native American women had to wait another 54 years until the 1924 Snyder Act assured Native American women the right to vote. Black women arguably had to wait another 95 years until passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, when I was a sophomore in high school, clarified that black women do have the right to vote. Since, during Mary Jane and Cassius's divorce proceedings, it became abundantly clear that gaining voting rights was the only path to female freedom and protection, next the Lionesses learned the process to achieve adoption of the 19th Amendment. In almost 250 years, the original Constitution has only been amended 27 times. Article 5 of the Constitution makes amendment an almost insurmountable two-step process. Step 1 requires that both the House and the Senate of the United States Congress must pass a proposed amendment by a 2/3 majority. If you can ever get that done, step 2 requires that 3/4, or then 36 of the state legislatures must also vote for the amendment's adoption. When the suffragettes were trying to get the 19th Amendment passed, these legislative bodies were all men. The Lionesses' activism for passage of the 19th Amendment began about 1876, which was 8 years into Mary Jane's divorce proceedings. It is no accident that after the Lionesses became politically active, In 1877, the 19th Amendment was initially introduced into the United States Congress. Thereafter, every year for 42 years, I repeat, thereafter, every year for 42 years, the bill for adoption of the 19th Amendment was either ignored or voted down by the United States Congress every year for 42 years. In 1917, World War I erupted. This time, war did not stop the suffragettes. For over 3 years, 6 days a week, they somewhat surrounded and encircled the White House. Have we heard of that happening before? Only they just carried picket signs. They weren't carrying guns. Despite the First Amendment's free speech guarantee, many of these women were arrested and incarcerated under abysmal conditions for speaking their minds. They protested with jailhouse hunger strikes. Reportedly, male prison officials retaliated by brutally pinning the women down and manually pushing and shoving feeding tubes and food up their noses and down their throats. These predatory horrors showcased women's disempowerment and emphasized that women were also not accorded other constitutional rights, including the Eighth Amendment's alleged protection against cruel and unusual punishment. These penal system tactics inspired public outrage, and decent men stepped up. In 1918, President Woodrow Wilson endorsed women's suffrage. My beloved Great Ma, who was born in 1899 on her family's land, what had been their land since the late about 1775, Boone Station near Athens, was 20 years old when Wilson endorsed suffrage. In 1919, after 42 years, the United States Congress finally considered and passed the 19th Amendment. Thereafter, subject to confirmation by at least 36 state legislatures, some women could finally vote. Kentucky's legislature ratified the 19th Amendment in January of 1920. 6 months later, Tennessee was the 36th state legislature to ratify the 19th Amendment. Thereafter, the law of the land set forth that the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. 72 years had passed since back in 1848, women had gathered in Seneca Falls, New York, to discuss attempting to gain an education, admission into the professions, the ability to possess, own, and control their own money, and the right to vote. The Lionesses of Whitehall and Homeland's activism had persisted for 44 years before the 19th Amendment was finally passed. The Lionesses had had a huge hand in the adoption of the 19th Amendment. Hereafter, only a small smattering of what these women did will be mentioned. Mary Barr Clay. In 1879, the year after her mother's divorce was finally granted, Mary Barr Clay attended the National Suffrage Conference, organized the first suffrage club in Kentucky, and created the Madison County Equal Rights Association. 5 years later, in Chicago, and I don't think William Townsend thought to mention this, Mary Barr became president of the American Women's Suffrage Association. In 1884, Mary Barr addressed the United States Senate's all-male Judiciary Committee. To recognize how daunting that might have been, 107 years later, the Senate Judiciary Committee, under the chairmanship of Joe Biden, skewered lawyer Anita Hill when she spoke before them in the 1991 U.S. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas confirmation hearings. And I kept her picture in my office for over 10 years. Thus, 107 years earlier, in 1884, Mary Barr Clay must have had nerves of steel to have asked all of those male U.S. senators, and I quote, "How can you return your mother's love by riveting the chains which hold her politically and civilly?" Perhaps the other most daring thing Mary Barr Clay ever did happened when Cassius was then living alone at Whitehall. Mary Barr Clay took her friend, national suffragette icon Susan B. Anthony, to Whitehall and introduced Cassius and Susan. In response, reportedly, Cassius instructed Mary Barr to give your guest a tour of my house. At Mary Barr's behest, Susan B. Anthony made multiple speaking engagements in central Kentucky. In an 1872 lawfare type of prosecution, Susan B. Anthony was arrested and convicted of illegal voting. On the 100th anniversary of the adoption of the 19th Amendment giving women voting rights, then President Trump pardoned Susan B. Anthony. Laura Clay. Laura Clay was a lioness of Whitehall. In 1874, within her diary, Laura Clay had written that her parents' then ongoing divorce proceedings had left her, quote, eyes unblinded to the unjust relations between men and women and the unworthy position of women. Subsequently, from Lexington's Christ Church Cathedral, Laura Clay advocated for opening lay leadership of the Episcopal Church to women. Laura became president of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association, which was the first statewide women's suffrage organization in the South. Laura lobbied to protect women's wages and property from men. Laura lobbied to make Transylvania College and Center College admit women. Laura campaigned to have the University of Kentucky build a dormitory to house women so if they'd let them go to school there, they had a place to live. Laura sought to raise the age of consent for girls to marry. Laura sought to establish juvenile courts to protect the rights of juveniles, including child brides. At the 1920 National Democratic Convention, Laura Clay's name was put forward as a potential candidate for nomination for President of the United States. Laura Clay was the first female so acknowledged by a major political party. Laura is also credited with having said that, and I quote, "Kentucky women are not idiots, even though they are closely related to Kentucky men." Sarah Sally Lewis Clay Bennett, who married James Bennett, her next-door neighbor, the brother of the Chenault Bennett gals, was a lioness of both Whitehall and Homelands. Sally was the founder of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association and a co-founder and president of the Madison County Equal Rights Association. She lobbied in the Kentucky Senate, in a United States Senate committee, and she wrote and presented to the U.S. Congress a voting rights treatise. Annie Warfield Clay, a lioness of Whitehall, lived in Richmond, Virginia, not Kentucky, where she was co-founder of the Equal Suffrage League and did innumerable things over there. Isabel Belle Harris Bennett was a lioness of homelands. Belle was a founder, officer, and executive board member of the Kentucky Equal Rights Association. Belle spoke for women's voting rights at the Southern and Midwestern suffrage conferences and before the Kentucky legislature. Belle's major work for women was through the Methodist Church. She traveled the world, established schools in China and Brazil, and created women's shelter homes in Texas, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Georgia. Belle saw to it that women's dormitories were built at colleges in Texas, Oklahoma, and Missouri. In London, Kentucky, Belle established Sue Bennett College in memory of her sister to help educate folks. Belle was instrumental in establishing in Nashville the Scariot College's Sue Bennett Retreat Center to promote women leaders in the Methodist Church. For their lives of inspiration, Mary Jane Warfield, Anna Petroff, Dora Richardson, and Cynthia Bogey are lionesses of Whitehall. In 1967, Kentucky's Republican First Lady Beulah Nunn spearheaded the restoration of the Whitehall Mansion. Most assumed Beulah restored Whitehall to commemorate Cassius Clay because he advocated abolition, and he was the founder of Kentucky's Republican Party, of which Beulah's governor husband was a member. However, given that Clay fell out with the Republican Party, given that in the 1940s Beulah was an organizer and first president of a business and professional women's club and went around advocating that, and I quote, "A woman can do anything on earth." Given that, Beulah, a woman, also restored the home of the woman, Mary Todd Lincoln, who was born in Lexington 3 years apart from Mary Jane Warfield, whose mother died when Mary Todd Lincoln was 6, and she was attended by Mary Jane Warfield Clay's physician father, and whose husband, Abraham Lincoln, had defeated Cassius and sent him off to Russia. And given that restoration of the Mary Todd Lincoln home was nationally the first such tribute ever accorded to a First Lady of the United States, plus given that Beulah, at the age of 13, had become an orphaned girl, it seems obvious that Kentucky's First Lady was restoring Whitehall, more so to preserve the legacies of the lionesses of Whitehall and homelands than she did it to put a spotlight on Cassius. Beulah, you too are clearly a lioness of Whitehall. And thank you to Margaret Cowling for some of those insights. The lionesses made a huge impact on my life. My dad, well, that's not my dad. It's good. Maybe it's not working. Okay. My dad, the World War II P-51 fighter pilot of 56 missions, was born in 1923, only 3 years after his eventually college-educated school teacher mom, my great ma, had achieved the right to vote. In 1983, when my great ma was 84 years old, I, her lawyer granddaughter, didn't apply for anything, but I got a phone call from the Kentucky Supreme Court. In that phone call, I was told they had something for me to do over there, and I was to come over there the next day. Subsequently, I was told that I was to become the chief law clerk at the historically totally all-male Kentucky Supreme Court. I also supposedly became the first ever female law clerk to a justice of that court, when simultaneously I was also appointed law clerk to Kentucky's Chief Justice. In taking my seat with the justices on the bench at the Supreme Court, gosh, there was a picture of the front page of the Courier-Journal showing this, and I guess it's gone, phooey. Okay, supposedly I became the first face of a woman to have ever been seen on that bench. I have, what in the world? Anyway, in the 191 years since Kentucky had become a state, or in the 63 years since America had passed the 19th Amendment. Rest assured, as the door opened for this Kentucky woman to first step out onto that bench, which today is dominantly, the justices are mostly women now in the majority. But back then, when I stepped out onto that bench, you can bet that the lionesses of Whitehall and Homelands, whose houses I'd driven past a million times as a kid, and the amazing pioneering women that were my ancestors, not to include, but certainly there are many more, Sarah Day Boone and Rebecca Boone. They filled my heart and soul with a deep sense of gratitude, pure gratitude. All of those women had paved my way, and I knew it. As one of Cassius Clay's grandsons, great-grandsons, direct lineal descendants once said to me, Donna, they all came to Kentucky and dreamed it, and you got to live it. And it's been quite a journey. So, with thanks to all of the lionesses of Whitehall and Homelands, you're everywhere. With thanks to the real lions of Whitehall and Homelands, who walk in tandem with their lionesses and take turns having each other's backs. And even with thanks to Cassius for having been a remarkably good catalyst and an incredible motivational guy, now our daughters and granddaughters are assured the right to get an education, be in the professions, possess, own, and control their own money, and vote. Thank you.